Hello and welcome to the Farming Week, the podcast from Agriland and AXA, keeping you up to date with all the latest in Irish agriculture. This is a very special edition of the Farming Week. We're here on the final day of the 2025 National Ploughing Championships in Screggan, Tullamore, County Offaly. A lot has happened over the last few days and a lot to talk about. But I'm joined here on the panel by my regular podcast partner in crime, Aisling O'Brien, along with Agriland beef specialist Breffney O'Brien and Agriland tillage specialist Richard Halloran. So I suppose, Richard, I'll start with you because it is the Ploughing Championships and you spent a lot of time out there in the ploughing field, out there watching the competitors. What kind of stood out for you out there in the fields?
Charles, you've just touched on it really. I mean, for me, the highlight is the opportunity to get down and see the ploughing in action, to get down to the plots. It's so peaceful there, the commitment of these people, the skill of these people. And I mean, obviously everybody, without exception, loves the horse ploughing. So we had the horse ploughing on the 3 days this year. It was tremendous. And for me, that is the highlight. And it just contrasts so well with the rest of the event. But it is very special for me and very perfect for me.
And Aisling, you were here on the stage hosting, you hosted several panels for Agriland here on the stage, and a lot was talked about. There was, generational renewal, nitrates derogation, farm safety was a big one. A lot of the topics that we'll be covering on a weekly basis in Agriland. But what were kind of the key takeaways from you, do you think, for those panels?
Yeah, so myself and the news editor at Agriland, Stella Meehan, were presenting discussions here on the stage, and Richard also hosted a really interesting discussion about the tillage sector and the issues facing that, and we might come back to that in a little while. But I suppose we had the Taoiseach, Simon Harris, here on stage. We had Mary Lou MacDonald, the Sinn Féin leader, on stage. We also, out in the field, spoke to Taoiseach Micheál Martin, and we talked to him about nitrates and the nitrates derogation as well. I think a big theme on the stage this year, because our theme for the ploughing in Agriland was the future of farming, Charles. So we heard from all of the farm organisation leaders on the stage, which would be a very common thing at the ploughing, to hear what they're setting out in their stall. Obviously, we've the budget coming up, we've got CAP negotiations going on, and a lot of big talking points out there on the ground with farmers as well. But we had young farmers on the stage, and young farmers took real centre stage here. They were talking about the issues that were mattering to them, and it comes on the back of obviously the Generational Renewal Commission's report that has come out this week and was launched at the Ploughing by Minister for Agriculture Martin Hayden. But I just think, listening to the young farmers, their appetite to want to stay in the sector, keep this sector alive, that's what we need. We also need to look after our older farmers and to make sure that they have a way to leave farming or to scale down in their farming or enter into collaborative partnerships with young farmers as well. And I think, we heard from Finn Walsh, and Finn Walsh would be, an influencer very familiar to many people. He's very, very funny on social media, and he was up here on the stage a little bit earlier on, and he was talking about an idea that one of his neighbours had, I think, and it was basically over a 10-year period, an approach to succession where a father or mother talk to their son or their daughter, whoever's looking to take on the farm, and over a 10-year period, each year they take over 10% more of the work and 10% more of the profit. In 8 years, they've 80% of the profit and 80% of the workload. So it's not a cliff edge. Everybody is on the same trajectory. People know where we're going. Now, maybe people will say that's over a very long period of time, we might need to shorten it. But I just thought it was a really good example of innovation coming from the young people. And look, we had, lots of TikTok stars walking around here. We had TikTok stars here in the tent as well. I think a personal highlight for me, Charles, this morning, I'm a big dog lover. I'm a big dog lover, Charles. I got to go over to the revenue stand, and maybe a lot of farmers will be going, what's her highlight is revenue? Well, actually, one of my favourite people that are, maybe not people, furry people that I met here at the Ploughing was Billy and Casey. And they were two members of the dog unit. And Casey actually works on behalf of the Department of Agriculture and has detected nearly every day in Dublin Airport meat and products that are coming in that shouldn't be in this country, and he's really just a charming member of revenue, I have to say. So he was one of my particular highlights.
Lovely. And Breffney, I suppose you've been, as well as been in here and seen, the beef side of things in your own brief as our beef specialist. You've also been around the site and taken in a lot of what's been going on, a lot of what's been said. So what are kind of the highlights from you? What are kind of the farmers that you've been speaking to, been talking about?
Yeah, Charles, so it's been a really busy couple of days for myself, as well as obviously being involved in panel discussions here and involved on a couple of different interviews as well, and radio interviews. I was up talking to some farmers up at the Certified Irish Angus stand. We were talking a little bit about, sustainability and integration of dairy beef systems. And I suppose that was a main focus on the beef area. We were also down today in the ICSA stand, where I was chairing a panel discussion on succession, and Aisling brought up some interesting points that were highlighted on the live stream here at Agriland, like Finn Walsh's point there. I thought that was a really interesting one too. So, the conversation is really starting to happen this year, and we've seen it becoming a much bigger talking point in the agri industry this year as well, and that was brought up in plenty of discussions down at the Plowing this year.
Yeah, and Breffney, yourself and Aisling just mentioned the issues of generational renewal and succession. And of course, this week we saw the long-awaited report from the Commission on generational renewal and farming. Aisling, I suppose, as I said, it's been a long-awaited report. But do you think it's going to bring a bit of clarity there for for not just young people, but older farmers as well, in terms of what the Department of Agriculture and the government intends to do on this?
Yeah, I think we have been waiting for it for a long time, Charles. And look, it comes on the back of the fact that only 4% of Irish farmers are under the age of 35, while 37% are over 65. So there is a huge issue with age demographic in our farming sector. It's not unique to Ireland, though. It's across the EU. And this Commission on Generational Renewal, it's chaired by Aidan O'Driscoll. And the group has come up with 31 recommendations for Minister Martin Hayden on how to address this issue. And I suppose there's no single way to sort this out, Charles. A generational renewal succession, it's an issue that's very, I suppose, subjective to each person's farm, their family situation, maybe the enterprise that they have, how viable it is for how many people might want to take over the land, and how that looks for each farm. But I suppose it was focusing on the cap and the next cap. Of course, we're looking beyond 2027 and how the next cap could help in this. And among some of the recommendations under that were the introduction of a young farmer establishment payment of up to €25,000 for family successors and new entrants. Then at the other end of the scale, the recommendation €5,000 also for older farmers, which would be integrated with young farmer establishment payments, and that would be payable on the transfer of the farm. So I think a big issue, of course, is access to land. It's farmers who are so keen. We see so many young people at the Ploughing, people who love farming, they want to be farming, but getting to farm and getting the access to the farm and getting the farms transferred over is a big issue. And I think taxation is another key point that was touched on in this generational renewal report as well. And Minister Martin Hayden was speaking to me at the launch here at the National Ploughing Championships, and he said, they want to keep those agricultural reliefs that we have in place, because those existing supports that we have are worth around €430 million, I think was the figure he gave last year. And if all the 31 recommendations in this plan did get over the line, which might be a very big ask, it would be worth on average to each farm about €120,000 is the figure that was put on it in this document. But obviously, if the tax supports are changed or anything like that, the Commission are saying that the Department of Finance has to extensively engage with stakeholders about any of those changes. And it's a huge document, Charles. We're going to be digesting this for a little while to come, but I think the initial reaction from farm organisations seems to be, we need the meat on the bones. We talk about this all the time when these plans come out, Charles, on the Farming Week, and I think we need to see action. A plan is great, and 31 recommendations are great. And Dennis Drennan, the ICMSA president, was speaking to Stella on the stage a while ago here in the Agriland tent. And he was saying we can't wait until 2028. there's farms out there now, like we can't put the pause button on succession. And I think the minister was very conscious of that. He said that he wants farmers to sit down around the kitchen table with their family and make that plan for the future. But it's going to take incentives, and it's going to take a lot of supports across a broad range of areas. And I suppose finally, just on it, the overall attractiveness of the sector was a key recommendation in this as well. And I think incomes, we need to make sure there's nearly full employment out there, Charles. And young farmers and young people have a lot of choices. They've a lot of options. We were talking to Katie Cooney a little bit earlier on here, a young farmer from Cavan, and she was saying about 10 farmers on her road, young farmers, or young people in rural Ireland, they've all gone to Australia. We need to try and keep our young people in rural Ireland. So that's a big ask.
And Breffney, you're a young man, you're in the farming community yourself. When you're chatting to other men and women similar age as yourself, is this an issue that kind of is coming up for them on a kind of routine basis?
Yeah, well, I suppose, Charles, is kind of very much kind of like a taboo subject. It's not really talked about much, in farms or in farm families, or even, until maybe this year it hadn't been brought up maybe at that many farmer meetings and things like that. A lot of people are maybe afraid to talk about it, afraid to maybe ask questions or maybe show any degree of interest. But thankfully, I feel anyways, this year we've really seen a lot more conversation and a lot more level of interest and engagement from people. They're looking to find out more, they're finding out different options. And even we've seen the winner of this year's Young Farmer of the Year competition, they came from no background of land whatsoever. They went out and leased a farm of their own in their own right. And even last year's winner actually was a dairy farmer also, albeit, but they got involved in a share farming agreement where there was a farmer who owned land and wanted to take a step back, and there was a young farmer who wanted to get involved in actively farming. So there are different collaboration options where the older generation do not have to let go of full control of the land, but they can give some, I suppose, with a financial control or allowance for young people to maybe own the livestock that are on the land and build stock numbers. So it's a good way maybe where both parties can maybe meet halfway or somewhere in the middle, Charles.
Richard, do you have a kind of a perspective on this generational renewal issue that's been talked about this week?
Are you suggesting that I might be the older contributor to this?
I wasn't suggesting it, but
Okay, so I don't know whether I'm happy or not to admit the fact that I could be, within that 37% of the plus 65-year-olds that are out there. But I agree with everything that Breffney and Aisling have said. I think too many government reports are produced. They're allowed to gather dust. Zero action or minimal action is taken. But there is a money element within all of this. I wouldn't be that qualified to talk a little bit about that. But for me, and I come back to the point really that Breffney made, it's all about communication within farming families. So how do you do that? Okay, so if you have a young person, boy or girl, young lady, young man, going to agricultural college, my view would be that farm succession should be included as a standard element within the curriculum that they would follow, irrespective of the agricultural college course that they follow, right through to degree level. And in doing that allows them to come home and saying to the parents, well, look, here's what we're talking about in college. This is new thinking for what do you think? Also, who do farmers actually go to when they really need advice? Accountants, solicitors. I mean, these guys have got to be encouraged. Those professionals have got to be encouraged to start talking about succession and encouraging their clients to look at succession. And it is a transition process. I mean, we talk about it to a large degree in a black and white sense. Breffney made the very point. You can transition from where you are today to the future in a very comfortable manner. But you've got to talk about it within families. And every opportunity that can be availed of to make that happen has got to be taken.
We'll just move on there and we'll move over to a subject in relation to the nitrates derogation. We saw this week the EPA put out a report that in the first 6 months of the year, nitrogen levels at 20 representative sites around the country increased by 16%. Now, obviously, it's coming towards crunch time, I suppose, when it comes to the nitrates derogation and the nitrates action programme. It's not clear that this report from the EPA would, factor into the result of the derogation approval in any way. But I suppose it is a disappointment, Aisling, and maybe we're slightly taken aback by it after a couple of years of improvement.
Yeah, I think we were, Charles. I think, we all felt that we were on the right track. And, there's a huge amount of work that farmers are doing on the ground. There's a lot of catchment programs. But as you said, this is an early insights nitrogen concentration indicator, which is the official title of this report. And these representatives monitoring sites, they're downstream points on Ireland's largest rivers. So Jenny Deacon, from the EPA program manager, was actually on stage with us. We had a really interesting water quality discussion here in the Agriland tent. And she did describe the findings as disappointing, and she said that it did follow several years of declining nitrogen levels from the testing that they do. And as you said, these reports, they all feed into our case to retain Ireland's nitrates derogation beyond the end of this year. But she did emphasise that nitrogen is only one element when it comes to water quality. And she said this is a snapshot rather than a definitive trend, which I think we can take some positives from without being naive about this. This is not a positive report it's an opportune time. And she does feel that there's an opportunity to turn this around. So I suppose we can't ignore it, but maybe it's not as bad, hopefully, as it seems firstly on paper. And we were talking to Michael Fitzmaurice, the Independent Ireland TD, a little bit earlier on, and we were speaking with the ICSA as well about this. And the feeling is that we hopefully will hold on to the derogation beyond the end of this year, but with the caveat of what cost does that come to maybe other sectors outside of the dairy sector? Will other sectors have to be asked to take on additional actions, or what's it going to look like? What terms and conditions will the EU Commission put on Ireland for retaining this nitrates derogation? And I suppose important to note that Ireland is to present its case tomorrow to the EU Nitrates Committee, and we of course will be closely following that on Agriland as well. And it's a huge issue, Charles. We've talked on the podcast about the economics of the derogation being all dropped to 170 across the board for those over 7,000 farmers, who avail of the nitrates derogation. We're not going to go over it again, but it's a very, very important issue. And we were talking to Taoiseach Micheál Martin earlier on as well. He was saying it is the number one priority. It's something that the government, when they were being formed, this was a big talking point. But he did say that we need to double down on efforts now when it comes to water quality as well.
Yeah, and I suppose, Richard, the report from the EPA, I suppose, as Aisling pointed out, it's not the full picture for the full year yet. But I suppose it is worrying, and that on top of the recent reports, Teagasc had a report, Dairy Industry Ireland had their report on it, on the impact of the derogation, the impact of the loss of the derogation. It is kind of worrying, I suppose.
Well, the first point I would make is that I would like to think that the results that have come through, courtesy of the analysis for 2025, will be quickly regarded as an outlier, because we've just had the driest summer, and prior to that, the driest spring in living memory. Now, I'm not a scientist to that extent, but I'm assuming that they're measuring concentration levels of nitrogen or whichever nutrient we're talking about. If those water levels are lower, nutrients are going to concentrate on, and you'll get that concentration effect. So I'd like to think that, given a fair one, Ireland will not be judged on the results that have come forward out of 2025. If you look at the bigger picture, we're seeing less nitrogen fertilizer used, and that's a trend that you can trace back over 10 years. Farmers are responding, contractors are responding in relation to how slurry is spread onto land, and how farm wastes are used in a more constructive manner. And those trends are there, the facts are there, the statistics are there. So the Irish government can go to the European Commission and say, yes, we are responding very positively and very proactively to the issue. And one would like to think that that's got to be taken into consideration when Brussels makes the final decision.
And just to your point, Richard, about the weather, I suppose it's important to point out that the EPA didn't attribute any particular cause to this increase that it's noted in the first 6 months of the year.
Yep.
But I'm just going to stay on matters related to the dairy sector for a minute. We had a couple of milk prices announced this week from processors, one of which was from Dairy Gold, which their price kind of took a notable knock of 3 cents per litre. You don't often see milk prices kind of decreasing by that much. And I think we've learned as well that they're going to have a meeting with their members next week on the issue. But But I suppose that's, speaking of being taken aback, Aisling, that's maybe something else that took us aback and took back dairy gold suppliers.
Yeah, it would have done, Charles. I think, look, there's a lot of focus here in Screggan for the last 3 days, but I do think, yeah, milk suppliers were taken aback by the level of that cut. And I know Dairy Gold did explain the reasoning for their reduction, and, they are pointing to global markets and particularly butter, which, their products that they've said have suffered more than a 3-cent a litre decline in terms of prices. It's, I suppose, it's disappointing for farmers, and we'll see what comes out of that meeting now as well.
Yeah. Another kind of key launch that occurred this week at the Ploughing Championships is the rural safety plan. And I suppose this touches on topics of rural crime, wildlife crime, things of that nature. And I suppose, Breffney, that's an issue, I suppose, that unfortunately is maybe not one we talk about until something bad happens. But I suppose, can you give your thoughts on kind of that as an issue, and the kind of is it important that we get this kind of clarity on rural safety?
Yeah, for sure, Charles. And, it's a big concern, and maybe more so in recent years too. We hear a little bit or a lot more maybe about rural isolation and things like that coming up. I know we live in the technology age where people do all have access to phones, things like that. But often, people who are maybe older people and living in rural areas on their own are victims of crime, and often all farms are victim of theft and crimes. But actually at the Ploughing this year, I've seen some examples of potential solutions to things like this. For example, there was one example down in the innovation area that had essentially, it was a marker or a collar or a tag essentially for sheep, and it would identify if there was dogs attacking the sheep, or it could also identify in the event of a sheep theft. It was basically a location or a tracking device to show where the sheep was. So I suppose technology maybe has a role to play, but it's maybe part of the solution rather than all of the solution.
And just very briefly, just before we finish, Richard, just the last point, you're obviously our tillage specialist. The tillage sector is going through a bit of difficulty at the moment. Obviously, there was the tillage crisis meeting. We had the Taoiseach here on stage talking about the tillage sector and his hopes to do something about that in the budget. What do you think needs to be seen for the tillage sector to kind of keep going and survive, I suppose?
Well, tillage is in crisis. Of that, there's no doubt. And government recognised this. There was a tillage crisis meeting in Nice last week. Martin Hayden, the Farm Minister, addressed an estimated crowd of 1,000 farmers. From the podium, he confirmed that there is an issue with tillage. We've had 3 very mediocre harvests, global grain prices, and let's be honest, the Irish tillage sector is operating in a global market, where grains, home-produced or native grains and oilseeds are concerned. Those international markets are on the floor at the moment, yet input costs are rising. And looking ahead, we're looking into another year of extreme challenge where sustainability within the tillage sector is concerned. So the guys need a support package, I think, and there's more than a strong possibility that there will be an announcement of a support package coming out of the budget on October the 7th. The industry needs more than a sticking plaster. There needs to be a strategic plan put in place to bring these guys through the next 5 years.
Thanks very much, Richard. And thank you very much, Aisling. And thank you very much, Breffney.
No problem.
That does bring us to the end of this very special edition of the Farming Week, which was brought to you here from the 2025 National Ploughing Championships. So from everyone here at Agriland, we hope you enjoyed the event if you were here, and all the best, and roll on 2026.